I'd like to welcome everybody here today and thank you all for coming. I see a lot of familiar faces out there, which is always great. First off, I'd like to introduce my sister, Gilda Lillian Drinkwater.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bob.
And my cousin, Doris Canclini Pinckney.
Nice to meet you. Thank you, Bob.
Okay.
Pixie? Did you say Pixie?
Pinckney.
Pinckney.
Pinckney. Yeah, it's sort of strange in a way, sort of a little different in a way, because when you consider yourselves growing up here now, you say we're part of history. Yeah, it's you say, where have all those years gone?
Really?
And those years have gone by, but they've been enjoyable years, and we enjoy it all as a great family. There's been some discussion about a family where our grandfather Peter and our grandmother Gilda came from, and there have been a couple articles in the paper, but I'm going to read just a little bit, sort of a brief history of when they came here and when we finally settled. Peter Canclini came to the United States from Italy in 1898, and the rest of his family, his wife Gilda and children, arrived in 1903. They first settled in Greenwood near Placerville, then Willits, where Gilda died in 1908. The family, Peter, 3 sons, Jill the oldest, Anthony and Hugo, 2 daughters, Assunta and Peirina. From Willits they moved to various places. History sort of got lost along the way. It was stated that at time they were in Santa Rosa. We do know at times they were in San Rafael. And then eventually the 2 daughters married and they went their way. Tony and my dad sort of worked on the ranch at that time. They came to the ranch, I think, probably at about 1915 or 1916. It's a little vague as to when they actually came, because there's a piece of paper that was signed by Woodrow Wilson stating that the property was acquired by the Canclini family in 1919. But my recollection from various people as they told me the history of the family is that they purchased that particular property from another family. And somewheres in our photo albums, there's one picture showing 2 people, which I do not recognize, at the house where it was much smaller. And so that I can determine they came in about 1915 and 1916. The first few years, Peter and Gildo made ties and shipped them by wagon to Albion. Gildo also worked for the Albion Lumber Company as a timber faller, mainly in the Camchi area. During World War II, Gildo and Anthony served in the U.S. Army in France in an engineering battalion making ties for the front lines. After the war ended, Gildo and Anthony returned to the ranch. Peter and Gildo established a dairy making cheese and butter and selling it to the logging camps in the area. As many as 25 cows were on the ranch, and it was a busy time for all. In 1918, Assunta and her 3 children moved to the ranch in Little River for a few years, after her husband Robert Reginelli died from the flu epidemic in San Francisco that year. In 1925, Gildo married Isidore Di Bernardi in Italy, brought her to the ranch in Little River where their 4 children, Henry, Gilda Lillian, Johnny, who passed away, and myself, were all born. During the late 1920s and 1930s, a small sawmill was operated intermittently on the ranch, sawing shakes and shook for huckleberry boxes. And I've got a picture of that, and I'll explain a little bit more about the huckleberry boxes and the shakes that were cut by my father and the mill. The mill is powered by a Fortune tractor purchased in 1923, as reported to be the first tractor of its type in the area. At this time, my wife, Mary Alice, and I reside on the ranch, along with 2 of our daughters and their families, and so it's still within the family. So briefly, that's sort of a short history of how the family eventually ended up in Little River. There's a lot of other things that occurred over those years and times where they did various things. So now I'm going to turn it over to my sister Lillian here, who's going to talk a little bit about what we did as kids.
First, Bob, I think you said that they served in World War II, but that's World War I, I'm sorry.
Nope, World War I.
Yeah. If that's
stand corrected.
Yeah, okay, I just wanted to correct you. This is a letter that I wrote to Edith Reginelli, my cousin, and she was one that lived on the ranch with her mother and her two brothers after her father died. And Ida graduated from Mendocino High School, and I regret that I cannot tell you what year it was, but her picture hangs up in the high school hall, along with all the Canclinis and all the other family members that have gone to school here at the Mendocino High School. She must have written me something about the old gate, and I'm sorry, in the time that I had to look for it, I couldn't locate it. And this is my reply to her, and then maybe I'll elaborate a little bit more after I get through reading this. And this more or less tells, she must have written to ask me something about the history, and this is my reply to her. But it starts out, enjoyed your old gate stood still, and it was a gate that was right out at the edge of the old county road. One of the things I remember about the gate was the fun of swinging on them back and forth, which we weren't to do as it would cause the gate to sag, but you know kids. Back there in the picture, a photograph that's on the folders back there, is a picture of my brother Henry and I on one of the gates, but it is not the one that she was referring to. But you know kids, Homer, and this, I'm going to leave out a little bit of this because this is referring to Homer, my husband at that time, who passed away in October of '03. Just one thing, he had started 500 tomato plants plus peppers, melons, squash, and flowers. With Alan and Beth's help, we made it through the summer. He was quite a gardener, and I just want to interject that because this is hanging up back there also. Memories. Here is a flashback of some of my memories of growing up on the ranch. Helping my mother in the house, cooking on the wood stove, and she could make the best homemade soup, and she would start that pot of soup from nothing, actually with a pot of water. We had homemade butter, we had all the vegetables that grew in the garden, and she would start out by browning some butter with some onions and the parsley, and then she would add the water, and then from there the melted butter gave the flavor just like it was broth, and she would put in all the chopped up vegetables, and usually with either rice or noodles as the base. And that was one of our main meals of the day, along with homemade bread and whatever else that could be provided on the table. And see, she could make the best homemade soup, making butter in a hand-turned churn, and cheese, heating and making the cheese. Let's see if I can explain this. Was quite a process from all those cows, and the cows were milked twice a day. The evening milk was put in pans in this, what we call the dairy, and there's a little picture of this back there in some of those pictures of the ranch. And then the next morning, milk was put in a big pot and put on the wood stove. The two milks were mixed together, and it was a whole milk cheese. The cream and everything was in it. It was very rich. When the milk was heated up to a certain temperature, then they would put in this rennet, which was something that would make the milk congeal, and the milk would all turn solid, and it was still quite warm. And then they had a big long stick with kind of 3 little prongs on it, and I used to love to do this, to take this stick and stir this milk all up and make it all into curds like cottage cheese, and they would sink to the bottom of the pot, and then the whey was poured off. The cheese, then curds were then put into a form. They had forms lined with a cloth, and a weight was put on, and all the curds was pressed out of the cheese. After it sat for a day or so like that, they were then put in what we call the dairy house, which had the cement floor, which made it nice and cool, and they were put on shelves and rubbed with salt. And by rubbing with salt, eventually it formed a crust on it. And from there then, they were taken and put down in the cellar, where also the wine barrels were stored, and they had a screen building, a screen shelf-like down there, and would go every so often and she would rub salt over it so that it would form quite a crust on the cheese. And the cheese would be very similar to now what we consider Jack cheese. And that was one of our staple foods. Okay, and let's go back to the, and then I went on after baking the cheese, heating the iron on the wood stove to iron the clothes. And of course we had those big old flat pieces of iron with a handle, and you heated the irons on the stove, and when I ironed the clothes, when the iron got cold, then you would move it over and get another one off the stove. Monday was wash day, hanging the clothes out on 2 long lines and then bringing them in. How good they smell from drying outdoors. I really appreciate PG&E, and all the water had to be heated by wood stove, and the light from those kerosene lamps wasn't very bright. And when the lamp chimneys got smoked up from turning the wick up too high, they had to be cleaned, and the lamps had to be filled all the time. Firewood and kindling had to be made, and the stove always needed wood, which had to be split. We walked to school, and there's the picture of McKay School back there. My brother Bob, myself, and Timothy Carto, right here, were the last 3 students to go to that school. I went 9 years. 8 years. I was the last one to graduate, and after I graduated, that was the end of the school.
How far did you have to walk?
About a mile. We walked to school, down the hill to McDonald's, Margaret McDonald's, where she lives down there, and back up the steep hill. And Margaret's sister-in-law was my teacher for 8 years, Georgina McDonald. She lived with them, and she and Jean and Jimmy Boyle, the other children of the McDonald family, would come to school with her, and on Friday she lived in Navarro, and on Friday she would drive home to Navarro and come back on Monday to teach school. And then we would walk down to McDonald's and back up the steep hill, down the gulch to Little River to try to catch a fish, and back up the steep hill. And we walked to visit the neighbors. There were cows, chickens, pigs, cats, kittens, and always a dog. There was always something that needed to be done. Much that we ate was produced on the ranch. There was always something growing in a kitchen garden. My father was a very marvelous gardener. Lettuce, onions, radishes, peas, herbs, carrots, and every year a large garden in the spring with beans, potatoes, and corn. There was also the fruit trees with apples, pears, plums, peaches, and big chestnut trees. I always looked forward when my dad made sausage, and there again is another story.
Excuse me.
The grinding the meat by hand in the old grinder, his mixing and measuring the spices, and the stuffing and tying the sausage in links. I have never found any that tasted as good as his. Picking huckleberries to ship to the city market, and one year my family said that I think they picked a ton of huckleberries and shipped to market. I think they got like 2 cents a pound for them, and my dad made the boxes for those. My dad and the sawmill, he felled the trees and cut the boards and made the boxes to ship the berries. The cows are milked twice a day. I never did learn to milk, and I haven't yet ever learned to milk. Eggs gathered and everything fed. My dad plowed and planted oats for hay. To town, what a treat. Dressing to go to Fort Bragg to the movies, not very often. To Little River Post Office for the mail, and to the stores in Mendocino, and trying to decide which piece of penny candy we would pick out this time. One of the happy memories of the Zia Sunta coming to visit. There are many more sad and glad ones. I'm going to save them for another time. And I'd like to mention that my aunt Zia Sunta, this is our aunt, Doris's and Bob's and mine, and the rest of my family that's here. She lived in the little red house that they tore down, only they reconstructed right here on Ukiah Street. I used to love to go there. You went through the front door, and there was a stairway that went up part way over with this funny little window there, and then they had another landing and went on upstairs. I used to love to come in and look out that window towards the ocean because it was such a funny little window. I think they put the new window in, but it's not the same. That's my story for now.
Okay. Yeah, one thing that she mentioned about milking cows, we moved into town in Mendocino in 1942, right across where the grammar school is right now. And we always had a cow. Guess who milked the cow? Morning and night. So right now, my wife Mary Alice and the daughters say, we ought to have a cow. I said, no way unless you're gonna milk it.
We tried, Daddy, we tried.
Anyway, I'd like to have Doris now talk about her father, Tony, and his family. And Doris, if you go ahead.
Yes, I have to tell you about when my mother and dad got married. I guess that's the best place to start. My dad married Annie Pioli, who lived in Mendocino, and they lived in East Mendocino, which we call Fury Town, but a lot of people don't call that Fury Town anymore. And they lived on the corner of Gurney Lane, and I think my grandfather built that house. Well, they had 9 children, and he was working on the steamer Brunswick out on the shore here, and a pile of lumber fell on him when he was working on that ship, and he died. So he left his wife there with 9 children, and they were, and you probably know some of them or heard of them. They were Cordo and James, Amelia, Lena, Peter, Annie, my mother, Irma, and Mary and Alfred. So after the accident, they moved into Fort Bragg because they just couldn't get along living here in Mendocino, so they moved to Fort Bragg. And my mother went to school in Mendocino and Noyo School in Fort Bragg. That was right down at Noyo, and it's not there anymore. And matter of fact, my 2 older children went to Noyo School when they went to school. So, and during the early years of their marriage, Annie and Tony lived in the logging camps at 10 Mile, Camp 28, and down to Camp 1. And the only one I remember is Camp 1, of course, because I was quite little. And my dad liked to play softball, so when they lived in Camp 1, I have a picture here of the softball team, and he helped these young men play softball. I remember them playing there. There was a field there, and they just had a great time. And we used to walk the tracks and go swimming and do a lot of different things there. And then sometimes Lillian and her family and Bob and their family would come. And this is a bridge there where the Maronis lived that we had to cross there at 10 Mile to go to their house. And so they called it the Swinging Bridge. And they're all standing on there, all of Bob's family and Lillian's family and mine and their mother and father. And there's Mr. Maroney here. And Ski Maroney is down sitting on the side there. Then we moved into Fort Bragg. I think I was in 3rd grade, and we moved up on Park Street. But then the Paul Bunyan Association started in 1939, so my father went to the meeting, because when he lived out in the camps, he was a tree faller. He felled trees and he bucked trees for Union Lumber Company. He did that for over 25 years. And I think he did the tree falling for 17 years, and the last 8 years or so he was a saw filer. And he filed saws. So he went to this meeting, and they were talking about Paul Bunyan days and the logging events, so he talked them to do the axe throwing. So they decided to do that, and I have some pictures of the Paul Bunyan. This is a picture, and I know it's kind of blurry, but my mother and dad in their first Paul Bunyan outfit, and you can see the Pacific Hotel and the Grand Hotel and the other pictures during the parade. And
You know what year that was?
that was in 1939. This is a picture of my sister Laura and myself and my brother Tony, which was born in Fort Bragg. He didn't live out in the camps. I think he might have been about 2 there. In our first Paul Bunyan outfits in 1939. So they're just quite interesting. And so they had a tug of war, and they had the woodsmen and the townsmen, and the townsmen said they could beat the woodsmen, so they planned a tug of war. And this is the first tug of war and the only tug of war in Fort Bragg.
Are you taking a picture right now?
Yes, she is.
Really simple. I like it.
To do that anymore, and the woodsmen's won, by the way. So, and Bud Torrance was the captain of this team, and they said he really helped them out a lot, telling them what to do and to keep pulling all the time. So I thought that was a nice picture. And then he was in the parade. He put this here, "You Dullum," and that's my brother Tony on the side. And he had his little car, and he was in the first parade. So during the axe throwing, they had the axe throwing, and I think you had... my father did more than axe throwing. He did the cross cutting and all the different things, and he won a lot of ribbons. We have a lot of ribbons. But one time, well, I might as well show you it now. You don't have to. This is my dad in the older years throwing the axe.
Oh, boy.
And I think she has a picture of that already. And then one year, there was 3 of the family in the axe throwing contest. My father, and I was married to Ed Silvera at that time, so he won second. And all 3 ribbons at that time. So that was all of that.
Boy.
And, he went to, him and Estelle Mitchell flew down to LA to the show. I don't know if you remember, You Asked For It? Well, he was on that show, and they were down there, I think, for the day, and threw the axe and told them all about the logging events in Fort Bragg. And when they came back, his first thing he said to me, "This is the first time I've been on an airplane, and this is my last. I'll go again." So he never went back on the airplane at all. So let's see what else I have written down here. And another thing my dad did, he was really into the Paul Bunyan Association. He was asked to make the axe for Paul Bunyan to carry. So he did, and Paul Bunyan today is still carrying the double-bitted axe that he made. And then he made another single-bitted axe that hung in Shattuck's bar. And I don't know exactly where that is anymore. I haven't seen it anymore, but I see Paul Bunyan every year with the axe that my dad made. So, and one thing he liked to do, he did other things besides doing that. He just loved to play baseball, and they had the baseball field there. And I don't have any pictures of that, but Lillian says she does, so I'm going to have to get some. Yeah. And he loved to play horseshoes and bocce ball. They used to have a bocce ball court there in Fort Bragg, and he played bocce ball. And bowling. He went bowling with my children, Randy and Bruce, all the time. And he belonged to the American Legion post 96 for I don't know how many years, as far back as I can remember, and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and he was very active in the Eagles. And one other thing he liked to do real well was going to Reno on the bus. He would take us out to go to the bus to Reno, and I would go. My mother wouldn't go at that time, so I would go. And he says, "Doris doesn't have to worry," he says, "because I have enough money for both of us." But before we came home, guess what? He borrowed money from me. So anyway, he had a great life, and I miss him. And I did say he had 3 children, my sister Laura, and myself, and my brother Tony. And he has now, from my sister's family, she passed away in 1980, and I miss her today. But she had 11 children, she had 3 children and 11 grandchildren. And she has 1 great-grandchildren. I wish she was here so she could see them. And I had 4 children, and I lost my son Randy when he was 17. And I have 6 grandchildren and 2 greats. And then I married Mr. Pinckney. Everybody's wondering about where I got the last name. We've been married for 25 years, and I accumulated 4 more children at that time, and 5 more grandchildren, and 2 more greats. So we have a large, large family.
Okay.
That's it.
Thank you, Doris.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit about Grandpa Peter and Grandma Gilda. They came to this country. Like I said, Grandpa Peter came first, and he was here several years till he earned enough money for the rest of them to leave Italy. And behind me is some photographs, a map of Italy, and it was done by Mary Alice and I's our granddaughter Alyssa, who lives out on the ranch now with our daughter Carla. And it shows up there, right up the top of Italy, where they came from. We're around on Lake Como. In 1903, my grandmother Gilda and the kids left Italy. They went by train to France and took a boat to New York City, Ellis Island. They came across country by train. And at that time, Grandpa Pieto was living, like I said, in Placerville, in that area. But he met them on the train when it got into Sacramento. And I'm going to read one little paragraph here. This little story was written by Edith Reginelli, who was our Aunt Assunta's daughter. Actually, it's Edith Reginelli Daly. She married Russ Daly. Anyway, she wrote most of the history on the family from way back when. And that's why a lot of it is on paper. And we're fortunate to have her to do that. Anyway, there's one paragraph. It says, as the train finally came to stop their destination, the family lined up the stairs and Papa Pietro reached his arms up and lifted each precious one down beside him. When he got to my mother, she asked in solemn seriousness, are you Pa? And that was Assunta. There was to be no guessing for her. She wanted the facts. Of course, everyone laughed and talked at once. Papa Pietro looked at the little family and said to Mama Gilda, where are the hats? Oh, they are here, she says. She reached for a bag containing several nice new men's hats. These are all part of our family history, which, thanks to Edith, they were written up. And she was the one that, over the years, we always have a family reunion. And 2 years ago, or 1 year ago, we had one at the ranch, and I'll bring up a photograph of that a little bit later on. Like I said, when Grandma Gilda passed away in Willits, and they went various places, because Grandpa Peter, I guess, was a little shook up when she passed away and didn't know what to do with all the kids, etc. And so they were in San Rafael, I think, for several years, and finally came here. But then, like I said, over the years, my father, in about 1917, he was falling timber for the Albion Lumber Company. And fortunately, I happen to have a couple of photographs, and they were on postcards. And so I knew someone who had some excellent photographic equipment. He made a negative of those two particular photographs. And what came out was better than was what on that particular postcard. And this first one right here is showing my father with two cousins. They were following this tree near Comshy. It's on the road that goes into the Shandell Ranch, which used to be at the time Openlander Ranch. It's now called Surprise Valley Ranch. And about a quarter to half a mile in from the Comshy Road is where this tree was, and about 100 yards off of that particular driveway. And this is the undercut taken of the tree. My father is in the white shirt. The delivered copies of them to him. So he is still alive, and he told me about this particular tree and where it was. And so he said up toward the top, there was a huge honey bee nest. And he said that they had a little bit of a problem when they were cutting the tree up into log lengths. Anyway, this is, like I said, is the undercut of the tree. Then this other photograph shows the backside. Matter of fact, I have still have 2 of these steel wedges. In those days, they made good steel wedges because normally steel will flatten out. These show no flattening out at all. They were excellent wedges, and I still use them. Anyway, these right here. One time, Mary Alice and I went out there to see if we could find the stump, but we couldn't find it. I think over the years, they may have cut the young growth away from it, and the stump may have burned up for pasture land. Anyway, this is part of the family history right here as far as timber fallers. And it goes to my brother Henry, who was a timber faller, and my wife Mary Alice's father was in the timber industry, and her brother.
And
So,
Uncle Tony. And Uncle Tony.
and Uncle Tony, sure. That's why brother Henry learned how to fall a redwood tree, was from Uncle Tony.
Yeah.
Question on that. You noticed that all the other redwood trees at that time were always cut off way high, maybe 10 or 12 feet up. These people were way ahead of their time. They were using the best part of the tree, not wasting it like they did in the old days.
Well, the reason for that, Tim, is because what they call the swell butt. Down at the bottom of the tree, it's spread out. And so to get up higher, so where they wouldn't have to work so hard at it, they went up on springboards.
I know, but
Yeah.
I really appreciate that because as a kid I used to have to cut those stumps down there.
Yeah, there were plenty of stumps on your place, weren't there?
Oh, there were.
Timothy, just to interject here, he lives in the city now, but he grew up about a mile or so from us towards up the little airport road, which we just beyond the McKay School, and so he really knows this past history of the Canclini family too.
Well, we were always working together.
Yeah.
We bought your dad's truck, the 1923 Model T. He had put those special planks that he made himself out of chinkapin oak on the sides of the bed, and they were so strong they never would give or break, and the truck ran perfectly until we left it in the 40s.
Yeah. Well, speaking of chinkapin, that gets to the next photograph that I have here. This photograph is taken by my father in the sawmill that we had, and I think it's probably about 1930, 31, 30.
This money to me, and I'm gonna take it down and invest it in Dick. I don't know if I'm being.
One of them, he told me about it. The heel of the orange, I don't know if the rest of it. Do you remember? I have a tree farm.
He cut with this particular sawmill. And this is a saw, and in the background, if you look closely, it'll be a little difficult for some of you to see it, is the 1923 Fordson tractor. It had a power takeoff on it and a big long belt, and it powered the saw. And you talk about an ornery type of a tractor to start. That was.
Bob, it still resides out at my place on the Compsey Road. We still have it. Mhm. And there's also more pictures of the mill back there on the poster boards back there. And showing some of the bolts of shakes and different things that there.
This is one of the shakes that he cut with that particular little mill. And this came off, it was either the side of the sawmill or the roof of the sawmill. And you can see where it's been weathered over the years that it was here. And eventually the timbers in the mill got so weak that the family spent time tearing it down. But what we did save as many as we could of these shakes.
Excuse me, Bob, can I interject one more thing? I can't help it, I'm terrible at doing this. Believe it or not, when Homer and I built the store in 1948, Homer's Market down on Main Street in Mendocino, we needed some boards. And my dad went out to the Prairie Ranch, cut the trees down, and went and cut boards on that sawmill that went in the store. And I still have those boards out at my place.
Yeah, and this is very fine old growth redwood, which came from on the ranch itself. And it's got a little beat up here at this end, but the best of these shakes that came off the mill I kept. when I built myself a barn out on the ranch where we're living now, I used a lot of those. So they're back being in use again. And like I say, it's a very light redwood, and it weathers just perfectly. And then, just a minute ago, Tim made mention of chinkapin.
You gonna explain to them what it is, Bob?
Yeah.
A lot of people know what it is.
Chinkapin I think, is from the oak family. And it's a native trees that grows here. There's not a heck of a lot of them, but they are. And you'll find the biggest of the chinkapin trees along the edge of the forest, along the, we call transitional pygmy, where they grow nice and big. Anyway, this particular piece is a piece of chinkapin that was cut on that sawmill. This came from Ike Jacobs at the Jacobs Ranch, because his father, when he was ranching there on the Jacobs Ranch, had a lot of horse-drawn farm equipment, and it needed wood on a lot of that equipment. And so when it got worn out or broken, he came to my dad, had my dad cut these particular pieces of wood so he could put them on that farm equipment. And luckily, a few years back, before Jake passed away, he brought this to me, said, this is where it came from. And I still have that as a memento of what was done. Lil, you might want to say a few more things?
Well, I was thinking about the huckleberries that they used to pick and the boxes that were made that goes along with the mill. And one of the things that my mother used to do was to actually earn a little extra money, because by that time my father was working off the ranch. I think he was working for the county road. He worked for the county for quite a little while. And then before he went on and become employed by the state highway department, we, as kids, we would go with my mother and we would walk from the ranch house over across the county road, go through that gate, over across the county road, and up to the part of the ranch which was across the county road where now Carla Canclini way back there lives, and where my grandson Kevin Spring lives on part of the property there that still belongs to the family. Kevin is the, let's see, I was going to say, Kevin and his wife and my great-granddaughter Catherine, who's 5 years old, live on the property where we were born and raised, and particularly where my mother would go to pick huckleberries, because they had what they call a shallow swale like there, and it seemed like there was a lot more moisture, and so that there would be more huckleberries. And one of the things was that she would take one big bucket, and then she would take another smaller container to pick the huckleberries in. And of course, you tried to pick them as clean as you could because you got better for them, more money for them when you shipped them. And then she would put the bucket by a tree, and she would hang a cloth up on the tree to indicate with the big bucket off, and then to wander off to the other sections to find the better berries. Well, invariably what would happen is we would lose sight of where the cloth was, and so then we would have to spend maybe time looking for where she had put the big bucket of huckleberries that she kept filling up. I don't know whether Bob can describe to you how the huckleberries were cleaned. They were cleaned in what we call a fan mill. And it was lots of fun to go out and turn the handle on this big old thing to watch the berries be shook and blow the leaves out and shake the little ones out. I was just trying to think of what else. Oh, go back to the Gilda name. It was my dad's mother's name was Gilda. I am Gilda, the second one. Everybody, I don't know why, but any of my immediate family, the Reginellis and all the personal families that grew up, all call me Lil. Eventually I became Lillian, and right now basically I'm Lil. Well, from me being the second Gilda, my youngest daughter, Gilda Gore, who lives in the state of Washington, and her youngest boy, Jason, my grandson, is back there. Jason Gore is back there. Her name is Gilda. From there, this is only on my side of the family, goes from Gilda Gore, goes to, Susan, my granddaughter Susan is Susan Gilda. She lives in McKinleyville, and her daughter is named, which is my great-granddaughter, is named Lauren Gilda. So we've gone this many generations down through the Gilda. Also, I want to mention my daughter Beth Spring is back there. She lives, of course, in Little River. She lives on the Kent Ranch. And of course, Bob has some of his family. He'll have to introduce his own family. All I can think of that we had very many happy memories of growing up at the ranch. There's a lot of stories probably that doesn't allow time to explain all these different things. My mother came when she was 25 years old. She didn't, I say my mother, but she's also the rest of the family's mother. She didn't speak a word of English. She was really kind of a girl, a person who grew up in the city. She had 2 sisters and 2 brothers. And how she ever had the strength and the courage to come to this country, I never did realize or understood. Her father, John DiBernardi, was in San Francisco in 1906 working to earn money to send to the family, and he was there during the earthquake, so maybe that was an inspiration. But she also had, and there's a picture of the family back there of us gathered at the ranch, a sister, Emma, and her husband, and a niece of Mary, who was born in this country and went back to Italy when she was 7 years old. There's a picture there showing the whole family gathering, and I was 1 month old. I was born May the 25th, and this picture was taken on June the 25th when they were getting ready to go back to Italy. My mother came to a place where there was not really the facility. She had electricity and running water and different things at home in Italy, because they lived in a little community, a beautiful place on Lake Como called Ojasca. And she walked about, I forget how many miles, to work in a cotton factory in Colico, she and her sisters, and they lived with the nuns during the week and then would walk home on weekends and bring their paychecks home to the family to support the family. When she came here, she was very fortunate that she had my aunt Zia Sunta, which I dearly loved. She was the most wonderful person. Mom couldn't speak a word of English. She could neither read nor write English. She left school when she was 12 years old in Italy and was able to read and write Italian. In the time that I was growing up and the family was growing up, with the help of very good neighbors and friends and family, she learned to read and write and speak Italian. It was really marvelous in the short, English, in the short time that she had there on the ranch to learn with, because we didn't have really any close neighbors we would visit occasionally. I always regretted the fact she never taught us children, or the family didn't teach our children the Italian. I've always regretted that. I could understand though, and when she didn't want my kids to understand what she was saying, she would speak to me in Italian and I could grasp what she was saying. See, to me, I always have regretted that she never went back, or she never was interested in going back to visit in Italy the family. And I don't know how many of the family is left back there. I wish maybe someday, maybe I'll still go. Edith Reginelli did go back, and I have pictures, and she's told us about the family back there. She had a younger brother eventually that came to live in this country. So that maybe the inspiration, the fact that her sister and family were here, made her, and how she and my father ever got together, I never could figure out. My understanding was that when my father was World War I, when the war was over, he got permission to go to Italy to see where the family, and it seemed like to me that somewhere along the way that there was maybe a family connection, because the two towns weren't that close. And there, of course, he met my mother, and that would have been 1918 or 19 when he went to Italy. And it wasn't until 1925 before she came and they got married. And I have the pictures of the two of them back there, which the rest of the family also have. They had, I know Mom told me that they had to have 2 ceremonies. one in the church, and I'm assuming the picture with her there with the hat on is the one that was in the church. The other picture was at a civil ceremony that they had to have, say like at a town hall or something. So this is what I recall. The only reason maybe I recall these things, Bobby is my baby brother. I call him my baby brother. I'm a little older than he is, and I'm maybe being in contact with my mother a lot more than the boys would be. And my grandfather, Peter, I think they felt that women were the ones who did the housework. And that's one reason I never learned to milk cows, and I never intended to. So consequently, maybe I picked up a little bit more of some of these personal histories of the family than what Bob would pick up, being as he was the younger one. Okay.
Can I say a few
Yeah.
things?
Doris,
You forgot about me over here, huh? We did go out to the ranch.
Oh, yes.
I wanted to tell you that.
Yeah.
We did go out to the ranch on the weekends when my father wasn't working, and that was our time to go do things, and we played softball out there all the time.
On that field.
On the field all the time, and I always got in trouble when we went out there because I picked the green apples off the tree. And Uncle Gildo would say, "Don't pick those, there are ripe ones over here." And I said, "Well, I don't like the ripe ones, I want the green ones." So I always got in trouble, and one thing I always remembered was the gooseberries. Oh, I just love
I forgot about
gooseberry
those.
pie, and they had the lovely gooseberries. But one day, something happened, they said it got blight or something, but the gooseberries were gone, and I've never
I
forgotten
forgot
that.
about that, Dov.
So
We used to
we
ship
really
Christmas.
had a great time going out there. And I wanted to tell you a little bit more about my sister and her family. She married Ed Speeney in Fort Bragg. I think you might know him. And they had 3 children, Larry and Debbie, Larry Speeney and Debbie Richards now, and Louise Goebel. And she passed away when she was only like 52 or 53 years old. So it's kind of sad she didn't get to see all her grandchildren. And then my children, I have, my oldest son is Wayne Silvera, and he lives in Stockton. And I have my daughter, Doreen, that married Bill Larson, that lives in Elk Grove. And my son Bruce lives in Fort Bragg. And of course our grandchildren and everything. But you know something? I forgot about my baby brother Tony. I didn't mention him, so I have to say that he now has Canclini Appliances, TV and Appliances in Fort Bragg across from Safeway. You probably all know him, especially when your stove breaks down. And he's married to Marilyn Pixie. Her nickname is Pixie, and he has 1 daughter, Lisa, and 2 grandchildren that he loves very much. And I guess Bob can talk now.
I don't know, Doris, whether we'll let him or not. I will say that there are pictures of Doris and Laura out there at the Canclini Prairie Ranch, back there on the poster boards, and I think that they're all marked. Laura was just a little bit older than I dearly loved her. She was my age. There wasn't too many girls out there where I was growing up, so consequently, we thought it was just great when Doris and Laura would come to visit. I did anyway.
Okay, Lil brought up something a little bit ago about the Huckleberry cleaning machine. That was quite a contraption, and I regret to this day that it
Yeah.
eventually withered away, and like a lot of the other buildings on the ranch, sort of just died down. Anyway, this particular machine, it was maybe about 3 to 4 feet wide, and it had a big crank handle that you would turn, and down at the somewhere maybe in the middle there was a paddle-like fan, and there were paddles maybe about maybe 6 inches high and about as wide as the machine. When you turned the handle, it created a wind. That wind blew all the leaves out, and they would go flying all the way outside the end of the building where they were. And then there was also a shake, rattle, and roll, because there was a cam action. When you turned the handle, this machine would just shake all over the place. And what it did, it shook out all the small berries and mostly the green ones. And then finally at the end, the berries would just flow down to a big trough-like bucket down in front of the machine. And so that's where the clean berries were. Now, like Lil said, when it went through the machine, the berries got beat up a little bit, so they didn't look quite as good as they should. So they got a lesser price on the market. And I can remember when I was picking berries, and my mother taught me how to pick them properly. We would get maybe 4 to 5 cents a pound. But I'll tell you what, in the late 30s, that made a big difference in those days. Because you got a $5 check from the market, wholesale market in San Francisco, that went a long ways. Anyway, so Mom taught me how to pick huckleberries the right way, and I call it the right way, and I still do it to this day. I enjoy going out in the brush and picking huckleberries. I do this. And 2 years ago, I picked over 300 pounds of them. Yeah. And when I get through, they're clean, ready to go. You might want to wash them, maybe you don't want to do it, but they're ready to go. And the way she did it says you find a bush that's got ripe berries on it, and you've got a bucket hanging on your side, and you use both hands. So you sort of roll those berries off. You don't pull the branch and take the leaves or anything else. You sort of roll them off in your hand, and you got them there, and you blow out all the blossoms and the leaves. You flick out the green ones, and when they're ready to go, they go in the bucket. That is the proper way how to pick a huckleberry.
Bob, there was a lot of people that picked, because huckleberry picking was really part of the Depression era for everybody. Albion Ridge, Compshe, wherever there was huckleberries growing, people picked huckleberries to make a little extra money. But some of the people had scoops. And what they would do then, they would scoop the berries off, and then that's the kind where they run them through the fan mill, but the berries would become kind of mashed much more so than when they scooped them off that way. Also, I can remember, and I don't remember actually seeing it, I can't really recall if I actually seen this. You know where the Pinckney Forest Road is there, we call that the Forks. And they said that at times past that some of that area where the airport is, and particularly right now, which was great huckleberry country, that they would actually burn that so that the new growth would come up, and then the good huckleberries then would be on this new growth, and they would actually set fires at that time to burn the old bushes down so that they could get more berries, which were such, like I say, a good part of what was the income of people in those times. I had forgotten the family did have gooseberries, and gooseberries was another one of the things that was raised around here that people raised during those years to earn extra money. And the family did have a gooseberry patch, Doris. I had forgotten all about that.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Strauss here, who had the restaurant and the Patton family, she made the best gooseberry pie of anybody that I know, except maybe Doris. Because Doris is the pie maker.
Well,
The other thing, I don't know if it's interest of anybody, I'm sorry I interject these things. I don't know if there's some have anything else.
I want to tell them about my family picking
Okay,
huckleberries
I
too,
will.
when you let me.
Okay, the only other thing I'm going to tell them about is the sausage making, because that was quite a part of the family, of the food that we existed on. What they raised a pig, the way from the cheese making and whatever apples and whatever other food that would maybe some grain or stuff went in to feed 1 or 2 pigs, particularly 1 pig. It was slaughtered during the winter months when it was cooled. The family did everything. They would heat up the big pot of water, dunk the pig in, scrape it, and there was a big birch tree that grew right outside by the house there. And they would, you remember that, Bob? They would hang the pig up overnight. The next day, it would be all cut up by hand, and then segregated out all the good pieces. The bones and the ribs, and some of those bones were put down into salt to keep them, and then later on would be boiled if there was any meat or anything on, but everything was taken off the bones the best they can. The meat was all ground up with a big old hand grinder, and then my dad would mix up all his secret spices. I think I finally figured it out, but of course it was in great big quantities. And one of the secret ingredients was that what they would do, I'm telling tales now, they would take good red homemade wine, and they would take a whole bunch of garlic, and they would heat the garlic up in the red wine. Then they would have this big pan of the ground pork meat, and they would pour this hot wine with all the spices all over that and mix it all up, and leave it sit overnight, and then the next day they had a special funnel that went on this hand grinder. You put the meat in the top and pushed it through, and they have the casings, and the meat would come out in big long casings. And one of the things that I really loved to do, I learned how to tie those so that we would have links that were about this big. It was quite a trick that they wound the string up on a stick, and they would boil it. I remember that. And then you would learn how to go down and made a special kind of a knot to tie all these sausages up into links. We didn't really make salami, but it was all sausages, and then they were hung in a cabinet there in the cool spot to continue to eat until we felt that they were still good to consume. But that was one of the main foods of part of the family that was, along with the garden and everything else that there was available at that time. I think Doris, tell about the ghost stories.
Oh, I get to talk now?
Yeah, you have a hard time going against me, Doris.
I know. Well, I remember picking huckleberries with my mother and my grandmother and her sisters. We'd go all over in Fort Bragg where there's houses now, up Simpson Lane, and we used to live on Eucalyptus Lane, which is called Boyce Lane now, and pick huckleberries. And we'd go in the morning and take lunch, and my cousins would go with us too, and we'd pick real well in the morning, but afternoon we'd go hide because we were so tired of picking huckleberries. And then when you pick them, you have to clean them and get them all ready for market. But that's how we earned our school clothes. There was no money like they have today for the children. We had to pick huckleberries for our school clothes. And then I forgot to tell you about the Depression. During the Depression, we went to Ukiah and we picked hops. I think I must have been 4 years old, and my sister and I would be out in the fields picking hops. And I can remember there were some men picking hops, and I don't think they got paid very much money, but they had a big sack of hops, and they came over and gave it to us so we could have hops to give to our parents and tell them that we picked them. And then I still remember one night we went into the tent there, and here was this great big king snake. And to today, I'm scared to death of snakes because this great big snake was curled up where we were supposed to sleep. But we didn't do that too long, but it was really hard in Fort Bragg when they had the Depression and everything. There was no money for people. And then when they had the strike in Fort Bragg, I imagine a lot of you people remember that, when Union Lumber Company had a strike. My dad went to work up in Arcata, fallen trees, and he never did go back to Union Lumber Company to work after the strike because he didn't feel right by doing it, and that's how he became a saw filer. He filed saws for all the different people, chainsaws and the bucking saws and all different things. He had his garage all set up with that. So then talking about huckleberries and pies, my mother lived next door to Claire's Pies, which was the pie shop that we opened up next to Tony's store. And she'd come over every morning because she lived next door, and she'd be ready to peel apples or anything that I was going to make. And she was very helpful. And I think that's why she lived so long, because she lived to be 92. And she would mix my pumpkins at Thanksgiving time and Christmas time. We had to make so many pies, and she'd mix the pumpkin and I'd make the crust. And when she passed away, I said, Willis, you know, I have to make pumpkin pie, and I don't know how to mix it. Because she did all the mixing, so she was very, very helpful. And she just enjoyed it very much, so.
Well, Bob?
I think it's Bob's turn.
Okay, speaking of apples, the original apple trees that were planted on the ranch are still there. As a matter of fact, they're producing apples. Like this year, the Gravensteins are going to be great. Some years are not as good, but this year they're great. About 30 years or so ago, because the trees were neglected maybe for about 30, 40 years, and they sort of went wild. So what I did, I used to come up there and camp in the summer when we lived elsewhere, and so I had a chainsaw. I went in there and worked those trees over. And boy, those trees came back, and they're producing apples like you wouldn't believe. There's a Spitzenberg, there's Gravenstein, there's a Winter Banana, and King. And so those apples were a big mainstay in those days for the families. And the ranch always grew a lot of things. I can remember digging potatoes. And those potatoes lasted us, and they also fed the pigs, the ones that were bad. And so, and there was always plenty growing there on the ranch, and so we did real well. the one job that my father had for a few years back in the WPA days, we had a truck. And when they were building the Mendocino woodlands out there on
yeah.
Big River, my father had a truck that he contracted with the federal government. He would go out there and he would haul the workers from the camp itself to wherever they were working. And that was his job. He contracted the truck out to do that. He did that for maybe, what, 3 or 4 years,
Yeah,
I guess, before he went to work for the county.
I don't know whether people realize, but Grandpa Peter lived there at the ranch size all the time that I was growing up, and he passed away at home there on the prairie. That's where he came there, and that's where he lived the rest of his life there after he once came to the ranch. So he was quite a stern man, and all our instructions were, don't talk while you eat.
This lady over here wants to say something.
The wording is manjatas.
Yeah.
Bob, this young lady over here wants to say
I
something.
wanted to know how many acres the ranch
Oh.
was and the location, please.
Okay,
80 acres.
yeah, the ranch originally was 80 acres. And it remained that way until about the maybe mid-50s, when my father started selling off pieces of property. And I think you lived on some of the first parcels that were sold. It was right where you are now and
Yeah.
across the road. It's located about 3.5 miles out Little River Airport Road.
So basically from the Pygmy Forest parking lot where,
Well,
No, not quite.
If you,
on where,
yeah,
where,
if you drive up from the Pygmy Forest and you're going up east on the road, the first houses you
Yeah.
see, well, like where Nicholas Wilson lives, that was the western edge
I
of
think
it.
it was 7 acres that he sold there originally, due to, say, maybe my grandfather needed financial help or something, because of, as he aged and got older, he become bedridden. And either my mother or they had somebody come in to take care of him because he would never leave the ranch. And so somewhere or the other, funds had to come to support taking care of my grandfather. And my father sold, I think the first was 7 acres. And I can't remember what he sold on the other side, a small acreage right there. Now, Bob still retains, how many acres, Bob? How many do you have here?
Oh, I had
I still have 22 acres,
about 20 acres.
and I don't intend to sell it, so don't ask me.
Yeah,
I'm
well,
sure glad that I have the acre that I have.
yeah. At this time, I'm going to introduce my family.
Yeah.
Carla just went out the door. That's Carla, our youngest daughter, and her fiance Doug. And
She's got a little one, Carla, Gina.
No, just a second.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
her
yeah,
daughter
yeah.
Alyssa is up
Yeah.
on vacation with another group, and standing up with my wife Mary Alice, who was a Fraser here, and she can tell you the history of Mendocino, some of her family. And then besides her is our middle daughter Gina, and our great-granddaughter Adria.
Yeah.
Now, Carla and Gina both live on the ranch. Our third daughter, Linda, lives in Tracy, and within a year, she will also be living on the ranch.
Have a compound.
So it's still family, it's going to remain in family, and that's how we look at the ranch itself.
Yeah.
And you know, it's getting time, but couple more pictures that I'm going to show. This first one here is a year ago last June, we had our 25th Canclini Family reunion. And there's the descendants of Peter and Gilda are in this picture. Some of the families are spread apart and they didn't come, but I think there's about maybe 70 to 75 people in this particular picture. And we had dinner that Friday night and then the barbecue on Sunday. And like I said, this is the 25th family reunion. And over the years, have been held down on the Russian River where another member of the Riccinelli families used to live. Then as part of that, this photograph here is of my dad and mother, Gildo and Isidore Canclini, and the descendants from them. It's the three of us and all the rest of the grandchildren, children, and great-grandchildren are in this particular photograph. And so, you know, it was a time where we had the family reunion. A lot of the younger members, the younger generations, did not know as to where the house used to be. The house burned in 1956, and subsequently built the house. Anyway, it burned in where the house used to be, where the barn used to be, where the so-called dairy building used to be, where the wine cellar used to be. Oh yeah, my dad used to make wine every year. As Italians, you know, you always had that red wine. Anyway, so this is why we had this 25th family reunion at that time, so then they can remember as they grow up, as others of us pass on, as to where it all started. Now, it's getting time, I think, that we can ask people if they have questions, you know, or comments about it. Tim?
Okay, I've got a question. It seems from my memory that your sawmill would have been, the Canclini sawmill, would have been the first one in that area of the county. First small one-man sawmill, because later on, many people, like our family got one, and the Koskis in Clancy or Melbourne got one, and but I think yours was the first.
Okay.
So your dad was very engineering and mechanically inclined, because a lot of the things he was doing the first, kind of like what you did with the chainsaw and those trees. Who would ever thought you could bring the apple trees back by taking the chainsaw to them?
Yes.
And also, I'd like to add, all the way from the beginning, Bob has been a good thinker, a careful thinker. I remember when we were kids down on the Albion River, and a big bull came around the corner, and what are we going to do? And Bob knew I liked to climb trees. I used to always be climbing trees, and so sure enough, I ran for the tree. I don't know if Bob was a good tree climber or not, or if he'd had the opportunity, but he was smart enough to think what to do. He grabbed my ankle. Up the tree we went.
Yeah, Tim, you and I have a lot of memories. I think in the late 40s, we used to hike the Little River and the Albion River watersheds. And I can remember one time we were hiking, and right where the Swanson Ranch is on Little Airport Road is now, we headed down toward Albion River, toward the McDonald Ranch. About halfway down the hillside, there was a big old steam donkey still sitting in the woods where they had abandoned it. So I imagine that's probably long gone now.
No, that was a beautiful machine. Well, you know, that,
Oh, yeah.
boy.
Yeah. Alice?
I can relate to Bob and Lillian's, but she was talking about killing the pig, and I remember my father doing that, but the one addition to my father's salami or sausage was my mother always had to go get the deer to bring it home to because venison was the mainstay along with the pork, but I remember watching her steam or whatever she did with the garlic and the wine.
Yeah,
But we didn't have a tub, we had a big long table that we mixed it
No,
on.
there was
But
a
I was only allowed to grind it, I was not allowed to pull the, but it was my job to clean the casing.
Oh, yes.
So I can relate to exactly what they're talking about, and that was,
I don't mean to interrupt because I will lose my thoughts, but the one thing that I think is written somewhere is the reason the sausage is quite an interest is that that's what Grandma Gilda died from over in Willits. She was making homemade sausages, and she tasted the raw pork and got trichinosis from it and passed away from it. That was the cause of her death so young. And so we've always been very, very careful. Huh?
30 years old, I think
I think she was about 30 years old, yes. There was only one picture that I know of that existed of her, and my cousin Ida had it, and after Ida passed away, I don't know what happened to that picture. I've always regretted the fact. You have a copy? Okay. Because I've always regretted, because it was my namesake. And Grandma Gilda is buried over in the cemetery in Willits. And whenever I can, I go to take flowers to her and think of her.
Okay, Margaret, you have a
Yeah,
question?
I had one thing I wanted you to bring out about your grandma Gilda while she was waiting for her husband to get settled over here. She didn't just sit idly there waiting. she actually grew silkworms
Oh, yes.
in Italy, which I had no idea that anybody in northern Italy, they lived up near the border with Switzerland.
That's right.
That there was such an industry.
Oh, yes.
And she did other things
Yeah.
too, but that was one of the things she did.
Yeah.
I remember
Yeah.
reading about
Yeah.
that, I have that
Mhm. Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Margaret, my mother often talked about doing that also. Yeah, they would actually go out and pick the leaves so that the silkworms could eat the leaves, and then they would form the, whatever they did.
The cocoons.
Yeah, the cocoons.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was quite prevalent in northern Italy at that time, is that what they did?
That was quite a factory area of, factories of cotton, because Grandma Isidore worked in the cotton factory, spinning threads. No, was it silk? I don't know. Well, okay. We'll argue about it. I love to argue.
Yeah, I know that.
We lost that argument.
They have to go a long ways out, talk me. Ask Flora, she knows.
Bob, how do you clean your huckleberries today?
How do I clean them?
How do you clean them after you pick them?
After I pick them, I clean them with both hands.
Just, that's all the cleaning you do?
That's all the
At-
cleaning that
at
I
the
do.
mo- Right there at the bush?
Right there at the bush, you
get
take
'em
them
home,
out,
you don't do
take them
any
out very carefully, and you blow out all the leaves and the blossoms, and you get rid of the green ones. There's a certain way you juicing your fingers, you can do that. When they're ready to go, they go in the bucket, and you can ask my wife, Mary Alice, because she just goes ahead and uses them just like that.
Let me tell you how I clean my
It takes
huckleberries.
practice to do that.
Let me tell you how I clean my huckleberries. I clean them pretty clean, but not as clean as Bob, but when I come into the house, I get one of my older towels, and I lay my towel out on the table, and I roll my huckleberries on them. Just roll your huckleberries off, and everything comes off, and they're nice and clean. You don't have to wash them.
That's what I do. I put them on a cookie sheet, and then it slants down,
Yeah.
they just roll right down,
But
and
you- but-
everything sticks to the towel.
The towel,
But
yes,
you've
everything
had all
sticks
that
to the
experience.
towel.
I thought maybe you
Yeah.
had some other better way.
And that's how I clean mine.
He doesn't have to pick a big quantity nowadays. It isn't like the Depression era when they had to go pick a whole big bunch of them to exist. Now he can go very careful.
Okay, one more thing that's being grown. My brother Henry is not here today because, like Lil, he has a blueberry farm up there near Shingle Springs, near
Placerville.
Placerville.
Yeah.
And it's right in the middle of their blueberries picking time right now. And he has a huge patch. And so Lil has her blueberry patch over the years. And, you know, like things like that grow good around here. If you nurture your plants and you treat the ground right, things will grow.
That's correct.
Any other questions from?
Not a question, Bob, but just a comment about your dad and how very involved he was with the American Legion and all of the other veterans organizations. And the other thing, that he holds the record for having served on the school board the longest in Mendocino County.
He was on the McKay School Board trustee
Yes,
also.
Well, a total of 35 years.
Did that
on
include
school
the
board.
McKay also?
And yes, it include, at least that's what I wrote, and that's what I found
Yes, he
in
did.
the
He's-
files.
He served with Margaret McDonald's mother-in-law, Lillian McDonald, on the school board. She was on the school board. My dad, I think, was at the same time, somewhere along the line, or someone of the McDonald family that was on the school board. And the little McKay School, if anybody's interested, was a little one-room school. You went through the front door. On this side was the room where you put your coats and your lunch pails and things of this nature, and there was a window there. On the other side was the little library. I wanted to go to school so bad that I begged, and they finally let me start when I was 5 years old to go to school, though I don't know if I can't remember whether I actually had any classes or not. But Tim had 2 sisters, Miriam and Olga, and I got to sit with Marion, and every Friday we got to paint, and I remember I had a square, and I would be painting these squares, and Marion would keep an eye after me. We played Annie over the old schoolhouse. It was nothing like throwing a ball over the time, and whoever got it, run around and see if you could catch him. We had a wood stove, and there was a wood shed. And as kids, we used to make guns with rubber bands or tire tubes, and then we'd have war trying to see who we could shoot everybody with. We had swings, and my father made teeter-totters for them. We had a well and with a pump like this, and eventually they put up a water tank and ran gravity water to the back of the school where we could have running water there. We had outdoor facilities, bathrooms. We played croquet. We hewed out this croquet court, and we'd play croquet by the hour. When I got the last year, I was the janitor. I got to oil the floors with the oil. I got to bang the erasers to take the dust out, wipe the blackboards down. We went to school basically in the summer months because there was no electricity, so there would be no lights. And I can't remember just what it was. We went so that early spring and in the summer months to a certain time, Bob and I and Henry and Johnny would walk from where we lived the mile to school and walked home again like everybody else. We took our own lunches, which were homemade bread with probably jelly and peanut butter. And one of the special things, if we were lucky, we would have the old relish bread on a sandwich, which was really great. Probably a fruit, I'm trying to remember, maybe an apple, and maybe sometimes an orange if we were able to get an orange. It was really, I was going to say, a real old-fashioned one-room school. Once a week, the music teacher came. Mr. Dixon would come once a week. We had the old wind-up phonograph, and he would play these classical music. Then we had a piano, and he would play some tunes on the piano. Then, see, I was trying to think of what else of interest as far as the school was concerned, because
Did
it was...
you have any apples in your lunch?
we probably had an apple in our lunch. We probably did. I was trying to remember what else.
I got one thing.
Oh.
The school put out a newspaper,
Oh, yes.
believe it or not, called the Prairie Bugle.
Yes, I even
And
have
you know,
some.
we call them prairies. And Tim, you gave me some of those copies a while back, and I was looking for them to bring
Yeah.
here today, and I couldn't find them. And I've got about a half a dozen copies that Tim gave me of the Prairie Bugle. And it was 8.5 by 11, maybe about 3 or 4 pages. And in those days, you didn't have a copy machine, you didn't
Oh,
have a
yeah.
printer or
Oh,
anything
gosh.
else. And it was a material, like a little gel-like material, and you typed on a special piece of paper.
Yeah.
There wasn't even,
No.
there wasn't even mimeograph.
It was purple stuff. It was purple.
It was a gel-like material, and you put that on top of the gel-like material. It took down the impression of what you had typed, and then you ran copies off of that.
Yeah, I remember that.
Hectograph.
Anyway, that was the other thing that the little one-room schoolhouse had.
Well, Bob, I don't know whether you remember or not, but the one thing that the little schoolhouse, in the winter months, we always had a Christmas program there. And they would bring in a big Christmas tree, and they had the clip-on candles that they would light with match, you know, which of course are very dangerous. But it was a family from all the local families, and the kids who went to school there would come to this Christmas program, and we got a little box of candy and an orange, and if I remember right, even a gift of some kind was given to us. But it was always something that the local kids really looked forward to, was to go to this Christmas program at the old McKay School. Do you remember it at all, Tim?
Yes, the kids had to actually take part in the play.
Oh, yes.
Everybody had to take part in the
Yeah,
play, and that
yeah.
was a really good experience.
Yeah.
Okay, Doris, would you like to have anything more you'd like to add?
Only that we went to Inglenook School. Do you know where that is? The Grange Hall? When we lived in Camp One, we would get on the bus and we'd have to go into town and we'd go to Inglenook School. I went there the first and second grade before we moved into town, into Fort Bragg. And we go out there every first Sunday and help at the breakfast out there to where I went to school. So, and then I want to introduce my husband Willis too. Stand up.
Briefly.
Okay,
I think that's
any
it.
other questions? I think, you know, it's getting time to
question on the telephone. Do you have any record on,
Oh.
so you were the first telephone for miles around
Oh,
there.
God.
Yeah, the only telephone around there.
That's right. So who put up that, all the wire for it?
Well, I guess my dad and some of the neighbors, because I know your family used to come down and use the telephone.
We used to come and use that phone and boy, you know, we take a lot of stuff for granted these days. We'd get your dad would come to our house and tell us in the morning, you're gonna get a phone call this afternoon, be prepared. A long time to get all the connections from Klamath Falls, Oregon, down to Little River, California. And brother would go down there about 4, and maybe by 6 or 8 that evening, the phone call would come through.
The phone went down to McDonald's too.
Went down to McDonald's.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a different system.
Yes, but it,
I don't think we were connected to the Canclinis at that time.
It was a hand crank telephone,
Oh, the
and you
same
had
kind of a
to do the
phone,
3
yeah.
rings, and you had to be careful that none of your neighbors were listening to it. Anyway, it was the Mathesons, the McDonalds, and the Canclinis were the ones that had the telephone.
You were on the same line then, but actually that line that went to our place went across the river and up the Albion Ridge.
Yeah, and probably up the Pasulas.
And the Andersons, Arch Anderson's
Yeah.
parents, and it went around to the Escalas. And the person who devised the telephone system was one of Emery Escala's uncles. I think it was George, but I get a bit confused about which Escala was which. But I know very well that it was an Escala uncle. And actually the Escalas were very advanced in many ways as far as practical engineering is concerned at that time. My husband for a number of years was the secretary treasurer of the telephone company, and after we were married he still was. And we collected the money from the people and then paid the telephone company that it was connected to, the long distance ones. And also, if the phone line went down, my husband, it often went down across the Albion River, but you had to go out and repair it yourself. You didn't wait for the Bell Telephone Company or AT&T to send their people out and fix it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think, it's come that time, and, it's time to end it. Sometimes we hate to do it, but it comes that time. And, on behalf of the Canclini family, Lil and Doris and all the rest of them, I'd like to thank the Kelly House and its staff, and especially Dee here for putting this on and allowing us to become part of what is history.
We're just very happy to have you, and let's give them a big hand. Thank you so much for being here and supporting this program.